Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 8th lecture in our Random Forest series. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to detect outliers in a dataset using one of the most important byproducts of random forests, the proximity matrix. We'll build on what we learned in the previous lecture about the proximity matrix and see how it can be used for outlier detection. Then, we'll implement the entire algorithm in Python and interpret the results together. The implementation you'll see in this lecture follows the original method proposed by Breiman and Adele Cutler, the creators of the random forest algorithm. Now, let's take a closer look at the outlier detection algorithm. The proximity matrix generated by a random forest can be used to identify outliers within a dataset. Unlike most outlier detection algorithms, such as isolation forest, which are based on unsupervised learning, random forest outlier detection is a supervised approach because it uses the target labels. This algorithm was introduced in the reference material written by Breiman and Adele Cutler that we briefly discussed in the first lecture of this series. An outlier is a sample that lies far away from the main distribution of the data. In other words, an outlier generally has very little similarity to the other samples in the dataset. Since the proximity matrix measures how similar samples are to one another, we can naturally use it to identify outliers. The algorithm consists of 3 steps. In the first step, we calculate the average proximity for each sample. The formula is shown here. Although the document refers to this as the average proximity, the formula is actually the sum of squared proximity values. For consistency with the original document, I'll continue to refer to it as the average proximity throughout this lecture. For each sample, we take all the samples that belong to the same class, square their proximity values, and sum them together. Let's understand this with a simple example. Here is a small proximity matrix consisting of 4 data samples. The class labels for these 4 samples are shown on the right. Let's use the formula to calculate the average proximity for sample 1. Sample 1 belongs to class 0. Among the remaining samples, samples 3 and 4 also belong to class 0. We take the proximity values between sample 1 and samples 3, 4, square each value, and then add them together. Notice that we don't simply add the proximity values together. Instead, we square each proximity value and then sum them. Since proximity values range from 0 to 1, squaring them preserves the influence of samples with proximity values close to 1, that is, samples that are very similar, while greatly reducing the influence of samples with proximity values close to 0 or samples that are far apart. For sample 1, the proximity values to samples 3 and 4 are both 0.1. Therefore, its average proximity is 0.02. Now let's calculate the average proximity for sample 2. Sample 2 belongs to class 1, and it is the only sample in that class. Therefore, its average proximity is 0. Next, consider sample 3. It belongs to class 0, and the other samples in the same class are samples 1 and 4. The corresponding proximity values are 0.1 and 0.8. After squaring these values and adding them together, we obtain an average proximity of 0.65. Sample 4 also belongs to class 0, and its proximity values to samples 1 and 3 are 0.1 and 0.8. Therefore, its average proximity is also 0.65. Samples with smaller average proximity values are more likely to be outliers because they are less similar to the other samples in their own class. Now let's move on to the second step of the algorithm. In this step, we compute the raw outlier measure, denoted by R of n. The formula is shown here. The numerator is simply the total number of samples, and the denominator is the average proximity from the previous step. Applying this formula gives us the following raw outlier measure for each sample. Notice that the raw outlier measure is inversely proportional to the average proximity. This means that the larger the raw outlier measure, the more likely the sample is to be an outlier. Now let's move on to the third and final step. Here, we compute the final outlier measure. This is simply a standardized version of the raw outlier measure. For samples 1, 3, and 4, which belong to class 0, the raw outlier measures are shown here. For sample 2, which belongs to class 1, the raw outlier measure is shown here. Next, we compute the median and the median absolute deviation, or MAD, for each class. We then standardize each sample's raw outlier measure using these two statistics. For example, the final outlier measure of sample 1, denoted by RF of 1, is obtained by subtracting the class 0 median from R1 and then dividing the result by the class 0 MAD. The final outlier measures for the remaining samples are computed in the same way. The larger this value, the more likely the sample is to be an outlier. You might wonder why we don't simply standardize the measures using the mean and standard deviation. The reason is that the mean and standard deviation can be significantly distorted by even a few extreme outliers, making them unreliable reference statistics. Instead, we use the median and MAD, which are much more robust to outliers. As a result, the final outlier measure remains stable even when a dataset contains a small number of extreme samples. Now that we understand the algorithm, let's implement it in Python. The dataset we'll use is shown here. We use make blobs to generate a synthetic two-dimensional dataset containing 600 samples from 2 different classes. The blue points belong to class 0 and the red points belong to class 1. First, we define a function that computes the proximity matrix. Since this is exactly the same function we used in the previous lecture, I won't go over it again. Here, we set the number of trees to 50 and the maximum depth to 5. Next, we create a random forest classifier model and train it using this dataset. Then we compute the proximity matrix. We then collect the indices of the samples belonging to each class. Let's say we have the following proximity matrix and class labels. The samples belonging to class 0 are samples 1, 3, and 4, while sample 2 is the only sample in class 1. Therefore, the list IY contains 2 lists, 1, 3, 4, and 2. Now, let's begin the first step of the algorithm by computing the average proximity. The goal of this step is to quantify how closely each sample is grouped with the other samples in its own class. As we iterate through the samples, we first retrieve the class label of the current sample and store it in the variable jClass. Next, we retrieve the indices of all samples belonging to the same class and store them in the array jsame. Following the formula introduced earlier, we square the proximity values in row I at the columns specified by jsame and then sum them. Repeating this process for every sample gives us the average proximity values stored in the list avgprox. Now let's move on to the second step of the implementation, where we compute the raw outlier measure and store the result in raw out. The formula is very straightforward. The numerator is simply the total number of samples, and the denominator is the average proximity that we computed in the previous step. Now let's move on to the third and final step, where we compute the final outlier measure. The purpose of this step is to standardize the raw outlier measures so that they can be compared fairly within each class. As before, we iterate through all the samples. For each sample, we first retrieve its class label and store it in jClass. We then obtain the indices of all the samples belonging to the same class and store them in jsame. Next, we compute the median of the raw outlier measures for all samples in the same class as the current sample. We then compute the absolute difference between each measure and the median, and take the median of these differences. This is called the median absolute deviation, or MAD-D. Finally, we standardize the raw out measure using the class-specific median and MAD-D and store the result in the final out list. The resulting value tells us how unusually large the raw outlier measure is compared with the typical samples in the same class. In other words, it measures how far a sample deviates from the normal behavior of its own class. Since a dataset may occasionally be so clean that the MAD becomes exactly zero, we also include a small safeguard to prevent division by zero errors. Now we're ready to detect the outliers. We simply rank the samples according to their final out values and classify the top 7% with the largest scores as outliers. Finally, we visualize the results by plotting the samples and highlighting the detected outliers with black circles. The visualization looks like this. These highlighted samples are the detected outliers. Notice that the normal samples are densely clustered around the center of each class. In contrast, the samples highlighted with black circles are located farther away from the centers of their respective classes and are scattered around the decision boundary between the two classes. You can also see that some of the blue samples inside the red cluster are identified as outliers. Likewise, some of the red samples located inside the blue cluster are also detected as outliers. The second figure shows another result generated by running the code again. Now let's run this code and see what we get. Here's the output. Now let's interpret the results. Notice that almost all of the detected outliers are located near the decision boundary between the two classes. Why does this happen? The key reason is that random forest outlier detection is based on supervised learning, where target labels are used to identify outliers, whereas unsupervised learning does not use target labels. Let's compare this with an unsupervised approach. Unsupervised outlier detection algorithms simply look for samples that are far away from the overall data distribution. For example, if the data distribution looks like this, these isolated samples would naturally be considered outliers because they are located far from the rest of the data. As a result, supervised and unsupervised methods identify different types of outliers and produce fundamentally different results. Now, let's take a closer look at the supervised case. Even though this sample is far from the main class 0 cluster, it still belongs to class 0. When a random forest constructs a decision tree, all of the samples in this region are assigned to the same leaf node. This is because all of the samples in that node already belong to the same class, so there is no need to split the node any further. As a result, their proximity values become quite large. In other words, they have high proximity to one another, even though they are far from the main cluster in the feature space. Consequently, these samples are treated as normal rather than as outliers. Interestingly, this behavior is closely related to the philosophy behind the hinge loss. The hinge loss does not penalize samples that are correctly classified with a sufficiently large margin, no matter how far they are from the decision boundary. Random forests follow a very similar principle. Random forest also ignores samples that can be confidently classified and focuses only on ambiguous samples near the decision boundary. This is why random forest outlier detection identifies suspicious samples near the decision boundary rather than isolated samples that are still easy to classify. Now let's look at some practical applications of supervised outlier detection. One common use case is cleaning labeled training datasets. When building a supervised dataset, labels are sometimes assigned incorrectly by mistake. This algorithm can help identify suspicious samples with potentially incorrect labels, making it much easier to detect and correct labeling errors before training a model. Another important application is in cybersecurity and financial fraud detection. In the real world, attackers are not naive. They don't behave in a way that makes them obviously different from normal users. Completely isolated samples are relatively easy for unsupervised algorithms to detect. Instead, sophisticated attackers try to imitate the behavior of legitimate users as closely as possible, while making only subtle changes that keep them near the decision boundary. In such cases, random forest outlier detection is particularly effective at identifying these suspicious samples. That is the fundamental difference between supervised and unsupervised outlier detection. In this lecture, we've learned how to use the random forest proximity matrix to detect outliers in a supervised learning setting. In the next lecture, we'll study isolation forest. Although it is not part of the random forest family, it is a powerful unsupervised outlier detection algorithm. We'll compare it with random forest outlier detection and see how the two approaches differ. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lecture.